It was a terrible thing to learn, I promise you. But it can't be true. My father had every faith in this house. She walked quick steps away from him, pacing the length of the parlor and stopping by the cold hearth. With her back to Thatcher, she began rearranging the tiny glass and porcelain dogs on the mantelpiece. This menagerie of china pets had survived being moved twice. Once for the precipitous relocation to Boston when her father's death left a widow and two young daughters without means, and now back here under Thatcher's keeping, to the very marble slab where the glass pups had spent their formative years. I hate to upset you, dear. It isn't a judgment against your father. Those horrible men. They gave me a headache tramping up and down the stairs. They wanted to be thorough. This is not what any of us expected. It isn't the best news for the builders either, if you consider it. I'm impressed with the man's honesty. He admitted we would be wasting our funds if we hired him to repair one crack at a time. Rose said nothing, devoting herself to her small porcelain friends. Darling, it's only a house. Vineland has fine houses on every street, and many are for sale. Or we could build something new to suit us, if the weekly can be believed. Captain Landis is still giving away building lots for the price of a bushel of strawberries. She turned to face him, with every feature sharpened. But with what money, Thatcher? If this one can't be sold or salvaged, what do we have? Finally, the change in her weather was here. Rose's calms were sweetly obdurate, but when they gave way to the storm, it was cruel. I have a good situation. We're young. We care for one another. We can't find our way to a new home, I'm sure. He hated the pleading tone in his voice. For all of us, of course. Your mother and Polly as well. Is it so terrible to think of beginning again? How can you even ask? Her mother has been thrown from rack to rails in all this. Boston was beginning again. You don't know how it was for her, losing father and having to pick us all up and go there. I'm sure it was devastating. Yes, at a time when a woman should be settling in for the rest of life with the comfort of friends and grocers and dressmakers, forced to grope her way around strange, filthy streets with Polly hardly more than a baby dragged into a stranger's home. Look what your new beginnings did for her. Polly is wild and uncultured. Boston can hardly be called uncivilized, Rose. It's true, I didn't see your troubles then, but your aunt was not a stranger. Taking in a sister and nieces in your circumstances was an ordinary kindness. We were an imposition. Uncle Fred never let Mother feel welcome entirely. He complained over everything, even the expense of our mourning clothes. Could Rose really have grown into womanhood, feeling humiliated in her aunt's household? It hadn't been apparent when he met her with admirers panting after her like hounds. He knew of the embarrassing debts, of course. Rose's father had died suddenly and left them worse than destitute. It wasn't a subject they opened. You never mentioned it before, he said. You never threatened to reduce us to all that again. He took a breath, disoriented. He was often overwhelmed by her right. Rose seemed, even in a wholly foolish position, when so convinced of her own righteousness. I can't think what your father's death has cost you all, especially Polly, who had so little time with him. But those were separate troubles from this house. I will never think of this house as my father as separate. We were happy under his roof, and would be happy still had we never been forced to leave it. Thatcher met her bitter gaze and had to look away. Something precious he'd possessed when he entered this room was now lost. He turned to the window, pulled aside the curtain, and pretended to look out. though he saw nothing, or worse, nothing magnified by 100 prismatic edges on leaded panes. The glaze of daylight blinded him. How could a man tell the truth and be reviled for it? Old wounds of a father's lickings made his ears roar with primordial dread, a wandering boy without shelter. Rose's temper had stung him before, but the renunciation of Boston was new. He hadn't been glad to leave that city and come here, even if the position was a good one and fortuitous, given his engagement. Their return was a social triumph for Rose's mother, after having been cast out of the garden. But for Thatcher, Boston was everything. Emancipation from rural childhood drudgery, his apprenticeship and education, the world of ideas, his heartiest friendships. All his best days were lived in Boston. Happiest of all were those when he courted and married Rose, a woman who would not have given him a glance had her fortunes in Vineland remained intact. A woman now standing on the hearth she wished she had never left. She'd said this. Her contempt for Boston included him. She'd reduced him to a child, and the whole of it appalled him. Her part in this and his own, as if he were still a beginner, begging for love and purpose. His eyes accommodated to the shapes outside, one by one. A passing carriage, the neighbor's good brick house in dark yew hedges, their expensive lot occupying the corner of 6th and Plum. The 2 saplings in his own yard that framed their view. Those trees had been planted by Rose's father to honor his daughters. The beech for Rose, the oak for Polly. Not for Rose and a hollyhock, but trees that now reached for the sky years after his death. No wonder they worshipped this sentimental man, exactly the type to be lured here by Landis's Elysian visions. The tale of 2 trees was a household favorite, and Thatcher always tolerated the words planted by father without comment. He dug many holes in his early life, irrigation ditches, even graves. He knew how it was done and by whom. Rose's father would have stood on the grass in a clean frock coat, his pink hand pointing, directing the labor of others. A platoon of Italian boys, probably, like those he'd seen this morning trenching earthworks along the rail line. If it came to pass that Thatcher could shake hands with President Grant, as Polly predicted, he would still be a man who viewed life from the bottom of the ditch, not the top. He had managed to rise a little and Rose to fall, arriving accidentally on a plane that accommodated their marriage. But the weight of their separate histories held the plane in uneasy balance. Beyond the trees and the carriage house, he could now make out the slim, recumbent shape of Mrs. Treat, still prone, her chin resting on her hands. She seemed to be watching some minuscule state of affairs playing out in the grass, as fully absorbed in that as Rose was now with her damned China dogs. Thatcher wondered if Dr. Treat had fled to New York in baffled isolation, shut out from his wife's fascinations. And as before, Thatcher's loyalty slid straight away from Dr. Treat toward his enigmatic other half. Here was mystery of the highest order. Mrs. Treat peering into the grass. Thatcher wanted to know what was holding her at attention on a hot August day. This woman belonged to his flank of humanity, those who would pick up the scalpel and cut open the pig. Investigators.